I didn't lose my sister. I became her. Those were the haunting words whispered by Lillian the moment her image shimmered before her family, revealing something no one could truly explain. A single birthday photograph of twin girls triggered the impossible. Clara and Lillian began merging into one. What happened next would challenge everything we thought we knew about identity, memory, and the human soul. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The autumn leaves crunched beneath Margaret Wright's feet as she hurried up the cobblestone path to Maple Hill Manor. The grand house stood tall against the orange and red backdrop of Connecticut hills, its windows gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Inside, preparations for her twin daughter's 9th birthday were well underway. Servants bustled about, arranging flowers and setting out fine china for tomorrow's celebration. "Clara, Lillian, where have you gotten to?" Margaret called, her voice echoing through the high-ceiling foyer. She smoothed her skirt with gloved hands and sighed. The girls were always wandering off, lost in their private world. Upstairs, in the East Wing playroom, Clara Wright sat cross-legged on the window seat, watching her sister Lillian arrange dolls in a perfect line. Though identical in appearance, both with honey blonde hair and blue eyes that seemed to shift color in different lights, anyone who knew them could tell them apart instantly. Clara moved through the world gently, quietly, her fingers often trailing along surfaces, as if reading them. Lillian stood straighter, spoke louder, and typically made decisions for them both. "Mother's looking for us," Clara said softly, not needing to look away from the window to know this fact. The twins often sensed things about each other that seemed impossible: feelings, thoughts, even physical sensations. Just last week, Lillian had dropped a teacup in the garden at the exact moment Clara had pricked her finger on a sewing needle upstairs. Lillian nodded, placing the last doll precisely. "She wants to make sure our dresses fit perfectly for tomorrow. The photographer is coming from Boston." She rolled her eyes but smiled. "Father's business associates will all be here with their boring children." "Mr. Hawthorne," Clara said, turning from the window. "That's the photographer's name. I heard Father talking about him. They say he captures more than just faces in his pictures. They say he captures souls." Lillian snorted and grabbed her sister's hand, pulling her up. "Don't be silly. It's just silver and chemicals and light. Come on, before Mother sends the staff to drag us downstairs." The girls descended the grand staircase hand in hand, their footsteps synchronized without conscious effort. Theodore Wright looked up from his newspaper as they entered the sitting room, offering a brief nod before returning to his reading. Their father was a serious man, an industrialist who had built the family fortune through railroads and manufacturing. He saw the girls as extensions of his legacy, particularly Lillian, who showed signs of his business acumen and decisive nature. "There you are," Margaret said, gesturing impatiently. "Final dress fittings, then penmanship practice. Tomorrow is an important day for this family." Clara caught Lillian's eye and suppressed a giggle. Their mother treated every social occasion like a military campaign. Perfect appearances, perfect manners, perfect everything, the right family standard. Later that night, after their parents had retired to their separate bedrooms, the twins lay awake in their shared room, whispering in the darkness. "Do you ever feel like something big is going to happen?" Clara asked, staring at the ceiling. "Like we're waiting for something, but we don't know what it is?" Lillian turned to look at her sister's profile in the moonlight. "What do you mean?" "I don't know exactly. Just a feeling. Like tomorrow might change things somehow. It's just a birthday, Clara. We'll have cake, open presents, and smile for Mr. Hawthorne's camera. Nothing is going to change." Lillian reached across the space between their beds and squeezed her twin's hand. "Now go to sleep. You know how Mother gets when we have circles under our eyes." Clara squeezed back, but couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled over her. Outside their window, clouds moved across the moon, casting shifting shadows across Maple Hill Manor. In the morning, everything would look normal again in the bright September sunshine. But for now, In the dark, Clara could almost feel something waiting, watching, preparing to step into their perfectly ordered lives. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Maple Hill Manor, casting golden rectangles across the polished floor of the grand salon. Clara and Lillian sat perfectly still on the burgundy settee, their blue dresses arranged just so, hands folded in their laps, exactly as their mother had instructed. The room smelled of furniture polish and the roses Margaret had cut fresh that morning. Mr. Hawthorne fussed with his camera, disappearing periodically beneath the black cloth draped over the back. His assistant arranged reflectors to capture the best light on the girls' faces. The twins had been posing for nearly 20 minutes, and Clara's back was beginning to ache. "Just a moment longer, young ladies," Hawthorne said, emerging from behind his equipment. He approached them, his expression thoughtful. "I'd like to try something different. Would you please interlace your fingers like this?" He demonstrated, weaving his own fingers together. The girls complied, Lillian's slightly larger hand fitting naturally against Clara's smaller one. As their fingers intertwined, Clara felt an odd tingle, like the static shock you get from walking across a wool rug in winter, except it didn't stop. It hummed between them, warm and persistent. "Did you feel that?" Clara whispered. "Shh," Lillian replied, her eyes fixed on the camera. But Clara noticed her sister's fingers tighten slightly around hers. "Perfect," Hawthorne exclaimed, rushing back to his position. "Now, please remain absolutely still. This exposure will take a few seconds." The flash powder ignited with a puff and a burst of brilliant light. For a split second, Clara felt strangely weightless, as if she might float away if not for Lillian's hand anchoring her to the settee. The sensation passed so quickly she wondered if she'd imagined it. "Excellent," Hawthorne said, already preparing a new glass plate. "Let's take one more, to be certain we have a perfect image." That evening, after the guests had gone and the birthday cake had been reduced to crumbs, Hawthorne returned to the manor with the developed photographs. The family gathered in the sitting room as he carefully removed the first image from its protective folder. "Oh my," Margaret said, leaning forward. "How lovely they look." Theodore nodded approvingly. "Fine work, Hawthorne. Very fine indeed." But Hawthorne wasn't looking at the adults. His eyes were fixed on the twins, watching their reaction. Clara stared at the photograph, her stomach doing a slow flip. There was something not quite right about the image. It showed her and Lillian sitting precisely as they had been, identical expressions of calm composure. But where their hands met in the center of the image, something strange had happened. Instead of clearly defined, interlaced fingers, there was a curious blur, as if their hands had somehow merged together. "Is that normal?" Lillian asked, pointing to the blurred spot. Hawthorne cleared his throat. "Sometimes movement during the exposure can cause such effects. That's why I always take more than one." He quickly presented the second photograph, which showed the same peculiar blurring. "But I assure you, the overall portrait is quite striking." Theodore waved dismissively. "It's fine. A small imperfection hardly matters." But Clara caught the photographer's eye and knew he was lying. This wasn't movement or a technical error. Something else had happened when the camera captured them, something neither Hawthorne nor anyone else could explain. Later, after the photographer had gone, Theodore insisted on displaying the portrait on the mantel in the main hall. "It's an excellent likeness despite the small blur," he declared, ending any further discussion. That night, Clara dreamed of hands, her hands, Lillian's hands, merging and separating like clay being molded by invisible fingers. She woke with a start to find Lillian sitting upright in her own bed across the room. "You felt it too," Lillian said. It wasn't a question. Clara nodded in the darkness. "When he took the picture, something happened. Something changed." "Don't be dramatic," Lillian said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "It's just a photograph." But as both girls lay back down and tried to sleep, the same thought circled in their minds. if it was just a photograph, why could they still feel that strange humming sensation whenever they looked at it? November arrived with biting winds and early frosts that painted intricate patterns on the windows of Maple Hill Manor. Clara sat at her desk, trying to focus on her arithmetic lesson, but her pencil kept slipping through her fingers. She frowned and gripped it tighter, pressing hard enough that her knuckles whitened. 3 times now this morning, the pencil had simply fallen. Except it hadn't felt like falling. It felt like her hand had temporarily forgotten it was solid. Across the room, Lillian looked up from her own work. "What's wrong?" she asked, though Clara hadn't said anything. "Nothing," Clara said quickly. "Just having trouble concentrating." Lillian gave her an odd look. "I felt your fingers go numb." Clara stared at her sister. They had always been attuned to each other's feelings and sometimes physical sensations, but this was different, more specific, more intense. "That's impossible," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew it wasn't. Later that day, during their music lesson, Clara seated herself at the piano. She positioned her fingers over the keys to begin her scales, but when she pressed down, her fingers passed halfway through the ivory before stopping. She jerked her hands back with a gasp. "Clara?" Their music teacher, Miss Abernathy, peered at her with concern. "Are you feeling unwell?" Clara looked down at her hands, which appeared perfectly normal now. "I'm fine. Sorry. Let me try," Lillian said, sliding onto the bench beside her sister. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play. Not scales, but the complicated Mozart piece that Clara had been practicing for weeks. Lillian had never been able to master it before, claiming her fingers weren't as nimble as Clara's. But now she played it perfectly, her fingers finding each note with Clara's characteristic delicacy. Miss Abernathy clapped her hands together. "Lillian, what wonderful progress you've made. I had no idea you'd been practicing this piece." Lillian's hands faltered on the keys. "I haven't," she whispered, so softly that only Clara could hear. That evening, Margaret came to brush the girls' hair before bed, a nightly ritual she rarely skipped despite the household staff who could have handled the task. She started with Clara, running the silver-backed brush through her daughter's honey-blonde hair. When she reached for a ribbon to tie it back, she paused, her hand hovering in midair. "Clara," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Please sit still, darling." "I am sitting still, Mother," Clara replied, puzzled. Margaret reached forward again, her fingers seeking Clara's temple to smooth a strand of hair. Clara felt her mother's touch, but it seemed lighter than usual, almost hesitant. In the mirror's reflection, she saw something that made her breath catch. Margaret's fingers had pressed slightly into her temple, as if Clara's flesh had the consistency of soft clay. Her mother quickly finished the task, her movements brisk and efficient, then moved to Lillian without comment. But Clara noticed her mother's hands trembled slightly as she brushed Lillian's hair. That night, after the house had gone quiet, Clara slipped out of bed and went to stand before the small mirror at her dressing table. The moonlight provided just enough illumination to see her reflection. She looked normal, pale in the silver light, but solid and whole. She raised her hand and watched its reflection do the same. "What's happening to us?" she whispered. Behind her, Lillian appeared, having crossed the room without making a sound. "I don't know," she admitted, standing close enough that their reflections merged in the small oval mirror. "But I can feel what you feel now. Not just emotions, but sensations. When your hand went strange at the piano today, I felt it in my own hand." "And you played my Mozart piece," Clara said. "How?" Lillian shook her head. "My fingers just knew, like they remembered something they hadn't actually learned." She hesitated, then added, "I'm having your dreams too, about the photograph." Clara turned away from the mirror to face her twin directly. "I'm scared, Lil." "Don't be," Lillian said, taking her sister's hand. "Whatever's happening, we're in it together. We always have been." She squeezed Clara's fingers, and both girls felt that now familiar hum of energy pass between them, stronger than before. Outside their window, The wind picked up, rattling the glass panes. Winter was coming, and with it, changes neither girl could yet imagine. December turned Maple Hill Manor into a landscape of white and gray. Snow blanketed the gardens and coated the trees, transforming the estate into something from a fairy tale. Inside, fires burned in every hearth, but Clara always felt cold. She had taken to wearing 2 sweaters, even in rooms that made everyone else perspire. "You need to eat more," Margaret told her at breakfast, watching with concern as Clara pushed food around her plate. "You're getting too thin." Clara nodded obediently and forced down another bite of toast, though food had started to taste like nothing at all. Across the table, Lillian winced slightly. Later, she confessed to Clara that she had tasted the toast in her own mouth, felt it stick in her own throat. "It's getting stronger," Lillian said as they sat in the window seat of their bedroom, watching snow fall. "Whatever is happening to us?" Clara nodded, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Do you think we should tell someone? Father or Dr. Fletcher?" Lillian considered this, her expression thoughtful. Unlike Clara, who had grown paler and thinner since their birthday, Lillian looked healthier than ever. Her cheeks had a constant flush, her movements were more energetic, and she had started speaking with more authority, even to adults. "Not Father," she decided. "He already thinks we make up stories for attention. But maybe Dr. Fletcher. He's always been kind to us." Doctor? Fletcher had been the right family physician since before the twins were born. He came to the manor the next day, ostensibly for Margaret's recurring headaches, but the girls managed to speak with him alone in the sunroom. "What an interesting situation," he said after they had stumbled through their explanation, his kind eyes showing curiosity rather than disbelief. He took Clara's pulse, then Lillian's, his bushy eyebrows rising slightly. "Most unusual." "What is it?" Lillian asked. "Well," he said, releasing her wrist, "your pulse is quite strong. Actually, stronger than normal for a girl your age. And Clara's is?" He hesitated. "Weaker?" Clara suggested. "Different," Dr. Fletcher corrected. "May I try something?" He pulled a stethoscope from his bag and listened first to Lillian's chest, then Clara's, his expression growing increasingly puzzled. "What do you hear?" Lillian demanded. Dr. Fletcher removed the stethoscope and stared at them both. "I can't be certain. It almost sounds like, no, that's impossible." "What's impossible?" the girls asked in unison. He shook his head. "I thought for a moment I heard 2 distinct heartbeats in Clara's chest. But that's medically impossible, of course." "A mistake in my listening." But his eyes showed doubt. That night, a snowstorm howled around the manor. Clara woke suddenly, her heart racing with a fear that wasn't her own. She sat up and saw Lillian standing at the window, staring out at the swirling white. "What's wrong?" Clara asked, climbing out of bed. "I'm changing," Lillian said without turning around. "I can feel parts of you inside me now, your memories, your feelings, even the way you think about things." Clara stood beside her sister, noticing how the snowflakes seemed to pass partially through her own reflection in the glass, while Lillian's reflection remained solid. "I'm changing too," she whispered, "but differently." Lillian finally turned to look at her, eyes wide with realization. "You're fading," she said, "and I'm absorbing you somehow." The thought should have terrified them both, but strangely, Clara felt a sense of peace settle over her. "Maybe this is how it's supposed to be," she said. "Maybe we were always meant to be one person, not 2. "That's crazy," Lillian said, but her voice lacked conviction. The next day, Clara discovered she could no longer go beyond the gates of Maple Hill Manor. She and Lillian had tried to walk to the nearby pond, but as Clara approached the property line, her body had begun to dissipate like morning mist in sunshine. She'd stumbled back onto the estate grounds, solidifying again, while Lillian watched in horror. "We need to understand what's happening," Lillian said as they hurried back to the house, her arm around Clara's shoulders. "We need to figure out the rules." And so they began to experiment, documenting each strange occurrence in a journal they kept hidden under a loose floorboard in their room. Clara's increasing transparency in certain lights, Lillian's new abilities, Clara's perfect pitch, her knack for languages, her artistic talent. The way Clara sometimes disappeared from mirrors entirely while Lillian's reflection grew more defined. The peculiar cold spots that followed Clara through the house, and the fact that Lillian now always felt warm even in the coldest rooms. "It's like I'm becoming more," Lillian said one evening as they wrote in their secret journal. "And you're becoming less," Clara finished, "at least in a physical way." Lillian closed the journal, her face troubled. "But I don't want to lose you." Clara smiled, reaching out to touch her sister's cheek with fingers that now sometimes passed through solid objects. "You won't be losing me. You'll be gaining me. We'll be together in a way no one else could ever understand." January brought no relief from the cold, or from the accelerating transformation of the Wright twins. Theodore, unable to face the increasingly obvious changes in his daughters, began spending more time in his Boston office. His visits home grew shorter, his conversations with the girls more stilted. He addressed only Lillian now, his eyes sliding past Clara as if she were already gone. One evening, as Theodore prepared to leave for another business trip, Margaret confronted him in his study, her voice carrying up the stairs to where the twins sat listening on the landing. "You cannot keep running away from this," Margaret said, her normally controlled voice rising with emotion. "They are your daughters, Theodore. Both of them." "I know very well who they are," Theodore replied stiffly, "but I cannot help with whatever this is. It isn't natural." "Natural or not, it is happening. Clara needs her father. Clara needs a doctor or a priest, not a businessman who doesn't understand what he's seen." Lillian felt Clara's hand tighten around hers, the pressure oddly uneven, solid in some spots, barely there in others. Clara's body had begun to change consistency throughout the day, sometimes appearing almost normal, other times becoming so transparent that servants had walked right past her without noticing. "I hate when they argue about us," Clara whispered. "About you, you mean," Lillian corrected gently. "Father still talks to me." Clara shrugged, the movement making her form shimmer slightly in the dim hallway light. "It's the same thing now, isn't it? We're becoming the same person." Margaret emerged from the study, her face composed, but her eyes red-rimmed. She spotted the girls on the landing and paused, then came up the stairs to join them. "Your father loves you both very much," she said, smoothing Clara's hair with a practiced motion. Though Lillian noticed her mother's hand passed slightly through the strands rather than displacing them. "He just doesn't understand what's happening." "Do you, Mother?" Lillian asked. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "No," she finally admitted. "But I've been reading things, books from your great-grandfather's collection in the library. There are accounts of similar phenomena throughout history." This was new. Their mother, always so practical and proper, researching supernatural explanations? "What kind of phenomena?" Lillian pressed. "Spiritual merging, soul transference, twin absorption." Margaret's voice grew quieter with each term. "The spiritualists call it psychic convergence, when two souls meant to be one find their way back to each other. Is that what you think is happening to us?" Clara asked. Margaret touched her daughter's face, her fingers connecting with what appeared to be solidity, though Lillian felt the touch on her own cheek as well. "I don't know, darling, but I've invited someone who might." The someone turned out to be Mrs. Harrington, a medium from Hartford who arrived the following week, wrapped in black shawls and smelling of lavender and mothballs. Theodore was away, which was just as well. He would never have allowed such a person in his home. Mrs. Harrington spent an hour alone with the twins in the library, asking questions, observing their interactions, occasionally closing her eyes and muttering under her breath. Finally, she called Margaret in to join them. Your daughters are experiencing a rare but documented phenomenon, the medium announced. Their souls were meant to be a single entity, but they were born as two. Now they are simply correcting the error. Correcting? Margaret echoed. Returning to their natural state, Mrs. Harrington clarified, the spiritual equivalent of water finding its level. Lillian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty library. But what happens when the correction is complete? Mrs. Harrington turned her sharp eyes on Lillian. You already know, child. You will be whole, as you were always meant to be. And Clara will be gone, Margaret said, her voice breaking. Not gone, the medium corrected. Integrated. There's a difference. After Mrs. Harrington left, promising to return when the integration was further advanced, Clara and Lillian retreated to their room. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Clara broke the silence. Do you believe her? Lillian considered the question carefully. I don't know, but it makes a strange kind of sense, doesn't it? We've always been different from other twins, closer, more connected. And now we're literally becoming one person, Clara added, holding up her hand to the lamplight. Her skin was translucent now, the bones visible as darker shadows within. Are you scared? Lillian asked. Clara thought about it. Her face, what could still be clearly seen of it, peaceful. Not exactly. It feels right somehow. Like I'm going somewhere I've always belonged. She turned to her sister with a small smile. Do you remember when we were little and I was afraid of the dark? You told me not to be scared because you'd always be there with me. Lillian nodded, a lump forming in her throat. Well, now I really will always be with you, Clara said simply. Inside you, part of you. Lillian reached out and took her sister's increasingly insubstantial hand. I'll keep you safe, she promised. I won't let you disappear completely. What neither girl said aloud was the question that troubled them both. When the integration was complete, who exactly would remain? Would Lillian still be Lillian? Would Clara still be Clara? Or would they become someone else entirely, someone neither of them recognized? Summer arrived with unusual heat, turning the manor's gardens into a riot of color and scent. Clara loved these gardens, especially the gardenias that grew along the south wall, their sweet fragrance filling the air on warm afternoons. Now, as she walked among them, the flowers seemed to respond to her presence, turning toward her like sunflowers following light. And everywhere she went, their scent followed, even in rooms where no flowers had been placed. It's like they know, she told Lillian, as they sat in the shade of an old oak tree. Like they can sense I'm changing. Lillian nodded, watching as a butterfly landed on Clara's arm and passed partially through it before flying away in apparent confusion. Everything's responding to you differently now. It was true. The physical world seemed increasingly unsure how to interact with Clara. Rain sometimes passed through her when she stood in it. Sunlight refracted oddly around her form, creating tiny rainbows. Even the house cats, once equally affectionate to both girls, now hissed and arched their backs when Clara approached, while they followed Lillian everywhere, pressing against her legs as if seeking extra warmth. For Lillian, summer brought different changes. Her physical presence seemed to expand, not in size, but in impact. When she entered rooms, lights seemed to brighten. Her voice carried farther. Even her shadow appeared more substantial, with sharply defined edges that sometimes moved slightly out of sync with her body. We're like magnets with opposite charges, Lillian observed one afternoon as they conducted another of their experiments. Clara had discovered she could now pass through solid walls if she concentrated, while Lillian found she could sometimes sense people and objects on the other side of those same walls, as if her awareness extended beyond her physical body. Clara nodded, her form shimmering in the summer heat. I'm becoming less physical, and you're becoming more. Not just physically, Lillian added. I have all these thoughts and feelings that don't feel like mine. Or they do, but they're also new. Like when I sit at the piano now, I don't just play like you used to. I feel the music the way you did. I understand it differently." Clara smiled, the expression making her face briefly more solid. "And I dream with your confidence now. In my dreams, I can do anything, go anywhere. I'm not afraid of anything." These conversations had become precious to them. The rest of the household had developed methods of coping with the strange phenomena, most of which involved pretending nothing unusual was happening. Servants had been instructed never to mention Clara's increasingly ghostly appearance, or the fact that she now rarely ate or slept. Margaret maintained an outward calm while continuing her clandestine research into similar cases throughout history. Theodore, when he was home at all, spoke only of normal, everyday matters, as if determined to force reality to conform to his expectations through sheer will. Only Dr. Fletcher acknowledged the situation directly, continuing his visits under the guise of routine checkups, but actually documenting the twins' transformation with scientific fascination. One particularly hot day in late June, he arrived with a new device, a camera similar to the one Mr. Hawthorne had used, but modified with special lenses. "A colleague in psychical research developed it," he explained, as he set it up in the conservatory where the light was strongest. "It's designed to capture, well, spirits, essentially. Images that might not be visible to the naked eye." Clara sat patiently as Dr. Fletcher took several photographs, the flash powder making her sneeze, one of the few normal physical reactions she still experienced consistently. When the doctor developed the plates later that day, the results left even him speechless. The photographs showed Clara exactly as she appeared now, partially transparent, her edges blurred, but they also revealed something else, a luminous outline around Lillian that precisely matched the shape and dimensions of Clara's form, as if she were projecting a second self outside her body. "Extraordinary," Dr. Fletcher murmured, showing the images to the twins. "It's as if you're already partially inside Lillian, Clara, while still maintaining your separate form." That night, unable to sleep as usual, she rarely slept more than an hour or two now, Clara stood at their bedroom window, watching heat lightning flicker on the horizon. Lillian slept soundly in her bed, occasionally murmuring phrases in Clara's voice, another new development. Their mother called it sleep-talking, but both girls knew it was Clara's thoughts surfacing through Lillian's subconscious. As Clara watched the distant lightning, she felt a strange pulling sensation in her chest, as if something were tugging gently but insistently at her very essence. She looked down and gasped softly. Her body, already transparent, was becoming visibly less substantial, like fog burning off in morning sunlight. She felt no pain, only a sense of movement, of flowing toward something or someone. She turned to look at her sleeping sister and saw tendrils of light extending from her own fading form toward Lillian's solid one. As she watched, mesmerized, the tendrils connected with Lillian's body and seemed to sink into her skin. With each connection, Clara felt herself grow lighter, less present, while the pull grew stronger. "It's happening," she whispered, not afraid, but awed. "We're really becoming one." Across the room, still deeply asleep, Lillian smiled and whispered back in Clara's exact voice, "Yes, finally." By August, Clara's physical presence had diminished so significantly that only those who knew to look for her could see her at all. She moved through the manor like a whisper, visible primarily as subtle shifts in light and temperature. Servants who had not already left their positions due to the strange occurrences now went about their duties with careful deliberation, their eyes fixed straight ahead when passing through areas where Clara was known to frequent. For Lillian, the physical world had never felt more vivid. Colors appeared brighter, sounds clearer, scents more complex. She could detect individual notes in Margaret's perfume, hear conversations through closed doors, and sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she could visualize the exact location of every person in the house as points of light in her mind. It's overwhelming sometimes, she confessed to Clara as they sat in their bedroom one evening. Clara's form barely visible except when she moved quickly, creating ripples in the air like heat distortion above summer roads. "I feel everything so intensely now. Is this how you always experience the world?" Clara's voice came as a soft vibration rather than a true sound. "Yes, I always felt everything deeply. You were better at filtering things out." "I don't know how to filter anymore," Lillian admitted. "Your emotions are in me now, alongside mine. Sometimes I can't tell which feelings are yours and which are mine." This was the hidden cost of their merger, the price Lillian hadn't fully anticipated. As Clara's physical form faded, her consciousness emerged more distinctly within Lillian's mind. Not as a separate voice exactly, but as a stream of thoughts, memories, and emotions that mingled with Lillian's own. Some days, Lillian would find herself weeping over a piece of music she'd never particularly cared for, but that had always moved Clara. Other times, she'd feel sudden, intense cravings for foods Clara had loved but she had disliked. The most disconcerting episodes came when Clara's consciousness briefly dominated their shared mind. Lillian would wake up to find herself in a different room, having moved through the house with no memory of doing so. Once she discovered herself in the garden at midnight, her nightgown damp with dew, Clara's favorite book of poetry in her hands. "I'm sorry," Clara had whispered, briefly visible in the moonlight. "I didn't mean to take control. It just happened." "It's okay," Lillian had assured her, but privately she worried. What if, when the merger was complete, she lost herself entirely? What if Clara's quieter, gentler nature overwhelmed her own more assertive personality? Dr. Fletcher continued to document these developments with increasing fascination. "From a scientific perspective, it's revolutionary," he told them during one of his visits. "Two consciousnesses occupying a single physical form. It challenges everything we understand about the nature of identity." "But what happens when the merger is complete?" Lillian asked, the question that had been troubling her for weeks finally surfacing. "Will I still be me?" Dr. Fletcher considered this thoughtfully. "I suspect you'll be neither purely Lillian nor purely Clara, but something new, a third consciousness that incorporates elements of both while transcending your individual limitations." This answer didn't entirely reassure Lillian. She had always defined herself in relation to Clara, the stronger twin, the leader, the protector. Who would she be if Clara was no longer separate, but part of her? That night, Lillian woke suddenly, her heart racing with unfamiliar fear. The room was filled with the scent of gardenias, so strong it was almost suffocating. Clara stood, or rather hovered, at the foot of her bed, her form more visible than it had been in weeks, though still transparent. "What's wrong?" Lillian asked, sitting up. "I need to show you something," Clara said, her voice surprisingly clear. "Come with me." Lillian followed her sister through the darkened house, down the grand staircase, and into the main hall where the birthday portrait still hung above the mantel. In the moonlight streaming through the tall windows, the photograph seemed to glow with its own inner light. "Look at it," Clara urged. "Really look." Lillian stepped closer, studying the image she had seen hundreds of times before. But tonight, something was different. The blur where their hands met in the center of the photograph had changed, expanded. Now it encompassed not just their hands, but their entire bodies, as if the camera had captured not just that moment, but all the moments that would follow. Their gradual merger already predicted in silver nitrate. "It knew," Lillian breathed. "The camera saw what would happen to us." Clara's form rippled like water disturbed by a stone. "Not the camera. Hawthorne. He knew what he was capturing. That's why he positioned us that way. Why he had us interlace our fingers." A chill ran through Lillian that had nothing to do with her sister's ghostly presence. "Are you saying he caused this? That he did this to us deliberately?" Clara's form wavered, growing less distinct. "Not caused, catalyzed. It was always going to happen, Lil. We were always meant to be one. The photograph just accelerated the process. Lillian stared at her disappearing sister, a complex mixture of emotions churning inside her. Anger at Hawthorne for his manipulation, fear of the changes still to come, but also a strange sense of acceptance, of rightness, that she suspected came from Clara. "Don't be afraid," Clara whispered, now barely visible even in the direct moonlight. "I'll still be here. We'll both be here. Just together. The way we were always supposed to be." As Clara's form faded entirely, Lillian felt a sudden warmth spread through her chest, as if she had swallowed sunlight. With it came a sense of calm, of completion. For the first time in months, she felt truly at peace with what was happening. She reached up to touch the photograph, her fingers tracing the outline of their merged hands. "Together," she whispered, and was not entirely sure whether the word had come from her own mind or from Clara's consciousness, now nestled more firmly inside her own. The winter of 1913 settled over Maple Hill Manor, blanketing the estate in pristine white. Inside, a new kind of peace had gradually replaced the tension that had gripped the household for months. Theodore had finally returned from his extended business trip in Boston, his acceptance of the situation evident in small but significant ways. He now addressed questions to Clara Lillian as if speaking to a single entity, and he had stopped flinching when unusual phenomena occurred around the house. Margaret had redecorated the twins' bedroom, combining elements both girls had loved. Clara's collection of pressed flowers now hung beside Lillian's maps, their books intermingled on shared shelves. She still set two places at the table during meals, though only Lillian's physical form occupied a chair. The empty place remained a gesture of acknowledgement, a recognition that Clara's consciousness still participated in family life, even if her body no longer did. Lillian herself had settled into her new reality with surprising grace. The initial disorientation of hosting two consciousnesses had given way to a balanced integration that felt increasingly natural. She no longer experienced the jarring shifts when Clara's personality briefly dominated. Instead, both perspectives seemed to operate simultaneously, offering complementary insights and responses to each situation. "It's like having an ongoing conversation inside my head," she explained to Dr. Fletcher during one of his regular visits. "Except it's not really talking. It's more like knowing what Clara would think or feel or say at the exact moment I'm thinking or feeling something myself." Dr. Fletcher nodded, making notes in the journal he had dedicated exclusively to documenting the twins' transformation. "And physically? Any new developments?" Lillian held out her hands, turning them over in the winter light streaming through the library windows. "My hands have changed shape. The bones have shifted." She demonstrated the difference. Her fingers were now slightly longer, the knuckles more delicate, combining her original structure with Clara's more graceful proportions. "Fascinating," Dr. Fletcher murmured. "And the other physical abilities you mentioned before? The enhanced senses? The awareness of others' locations in the house? All still present," Lillian confirmed, "but more controlled now. I can turn them up or down as needed." She smiled. "Clara was always better at that, at filtering sensory input. Now I understand how she did it." Outside the library door, Margaret paused on her way past, listening. The easy way Lillian spoke about Clara, in both past and present tense, still unsettled her somewhat, but she was learning to accept it. The truth was, her daughters, seemed happier and more at peace than they had been in years. The strain of being two halves of what should have been one whole had lifted, replaced by a completion that, while unconventional, seemed right for them. By Christmas, the household had established new rituals that acknowledged their changed reality. Gifts were addressed to Lillian and Clara. Carols were played on the piano with a technical precision and emotional depth that combined both girls' musical talents. And the traditional family photograph included an empty chair beside Lillian. Though when the image was developed, a faint luminous outline appeared in that space, visible from certain angles, but not others. Theodore, examining the photograph on Christmas evening, finally asked the question that had been on his mind for months. Do you see her still, or is she just inside you now? Lillian considered how to explain something so complex to her literal-minded father. Both, she finally said. Most of the time, she's part of me, integrated with my thoughts and perceptions. But sometimes, especially at dawn or dusk, or during strong emotional moments, I can see her separately. Not physically, exactly, but as a kind of presence beside me. Theodore nodded slowly, returning the photograph to its place on his desk. And you're happy this way? Yes, Lillian said without hesitation. We're whole now, the way we were meant to be. The new year brought visits from relatives who had not seen Lillian since before the transformation began. Margaret prepared them as best she could, explaining that Clara was away at school, while privately warning them that they might notice changes in Lillian. None were prepared for the reality. A girl who looked like Lillian but moved with Clara's grace, who spoke sometimes with Lillian's confidence and sometimes with Clara's gentle thoughtfulness, who knew things only Clara had known while retaining all of Lillian's memories as well. It's uncanny, Aunt Beatrice whispered to Margaret after dinner one evening. She started speaking to me in French, Clara's French, with that perfect accent. Then switched to English mid-sentence without seeming to notice. Margaret merely smiled. She's still finding her balance, she said simply. As winter deepened, Lillian discovered that her connection to Maple Hill Manor had intensified. She could sense changes in the weather hours before they occurred, could locate lost objects without searching, could even, occasionally, influence the house itself, causing lights to brighten or dim, fires to strengthen or subside, all with a mere thought. The estate that had witnessed their transformation now seemed attuned to her, responsive to her integrated consciousness in ways that suggested the merger extended beyond her physical form to encompass the environment that had facilitated it. It's as if the house remembers both of us, she told Dr. Fletcher, as if it's part of our merger somehow. The doctor's eyes lit with scientific curiosity, a fascinating possibility. Perhaps consciousness isn't as contained by our physical forms as we've always believed. Perhaps it extends into our surroundings, particularly places with strong emotional significance. Lillian nodded, thinking of how the gardenias Clara had loved now bloomed out of season. How rooms she entered subtly adjusted their temperature to the perfect balance between what Clara had preferred and what Lillian had found comfortable. How even the very air seemed to welcome her in ways it never had before. We've become something more than just two girls merged into one, she said, touching the locket she always wore now, containing miniature portraits of both twins painted the year before. We've become a part of this place, and it's become a part of us. September 1914 arrived with golden light and crisp air, bringing with it the twins' 11th birthday. The previous year's subdued acknowledgement gave way to a proper celebration, as if the family had collectively decided that accepting their new reality warranted a return to certain traditions. Margaret planned a small gathering with a few trusted friends and relatives who had been informed of the situation, while Theodore, in a gesture that surprised everyone, commissioned a new portrait to commemorate the occasion. Not Hawthorne, he specified firmly. Find someone else, someone with no special abilities. Margaret selected a young female photographer from Hartford whose work was known for its artistic sensitivity. Miss Eleanor Bennett arrived at Maple Hill Manor a week before the birthday, her camera equipment notably more modern than Hawthorne's had been, her manner professional and matter-of-fact. I understand this is a special portrait, she said as she set up in the grand salon, the same room where the original photograph had been taken. Mrs. Wright mentioned there are unique considerations. Lillian, seated on the same burgundy settee, nodded. You could say that. She wore a blue dress similar to the one from the previous year's portrait, but with subtle differences that acknowledged her transformed state. The fabric was a blend of her preferred structured style and Clara's softer preferences. The color a shade between Lillian's favored navy and Clara's preferred cornflower blue. "My sister won't appear in the photograph," Lillian explained. "Not in a way most people can see, anyway." Miss Bennet paused in her preparations. "Your sister?" "Clara," Lillian said simply. "She's part of me now, but sometimes she manifests separately. Don't be alarmed if you see something unusual through your lens." To her credit, Miss Bennet merely nodded and continued her work. "I've photographed spiritualist gatherings before," she said. "I keep an open mind about what might appear in my images." The portrait session proceeded smoothly, with Lillian maintaining perfect composure, despite the fact that Clara's consciousness was particularly active that day, her presence rippling just beneath the surface of their shared form. As Miss Bennet made her final exposure, several guests who had gathered to watch reported seeing a momentary shimmer in the air around Lillian, as if heat waves had suddenly risen from the floor, distorting the light. When the photographs were developed and delivered the following day, the resulting images confirmed what everyone had sensed. Lillian appeared clearly in the center of each frame, but surrounding her was a subtle luminous outline that created the impression of a second presence, not quite manifest, but undeniably there. "Some subjects simply bring their own light," Miss Bennet commented when Theodore questioned the effect. "I can't explain it technically, but it's quite beautiful, don't you think?" The birthday celebration itself became a watershed moment for the Wright family. Guests who had known both twins previously found themselves drawn to Lillian with fascination, many commenting on how she seemed more complete than they remembered. Throughout the evening, she navigated complex social interactions with newfound grace, drawing on Clara's intuitive understanding of others' emotional states combined with her own natural confidence. When one elderly relative directly asked about Clara's whereabouts, Lillian answered with simple truth: "She is here. We are together in ways that matter most." After the guests had departed and the house had grown quiet, Lillian slipped out to the garden where the last of the summer flowers still bloomed. The night air was cool against her skin, carrying the scent of approaching autumn. She sat on a stone bench beneath a maple tree, beginning to show hints of its coming transformation, its green leaves edged with gold and red. "We're 11 today," she said softly to the empty air beside her, though she didn't feel alone. "Both of us." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves overhead, sending a shower of early maple seeds spinning down around her like tiny helicopters. One landed on her open palm, and as she watched, it began to rotate slowly, without any wind to move it. "I know," she answered, responding to a thought that had surfaced in her mind. Clara's thought, suggesting they explore the attic tomorrow to find the journals of previous Wright twins who had lived at Maple Hill Manor. "I'm curious too." This was how they communicated now, Clara's consciousness forming thoughts that rose into Lillian's awareness, Lillian responding sometimes aloud, sometimes silently, in a continuous internal dialogue that felt as natural as breathing. They were neither fully separate nor completely merged, but existed in a balanced integration that honored both their individual essences. The following morning, Lillian approached her parents at breakfast with newfound purpose. "I want to understand more about what happened to us," she announced, "and why it happened here at Maple Hill Manor." Theodore looked up from his newspaper, a flicker of the old unease crossing his face. "What do you mean?" "Clara and I believe we weren't the first twins this has happened to," Lillian explained. "We want to research the history of the house and of the Wright family. We think there might have been others before us." Margaret and Theodore exchanged glances. "What makes you think that?" Margaret asked carefully. "Dreams," Lillian said simply. "Clara's been having dreams about other twins, brothers, not sisters, during the Civil War era. They were wounded and brought back here to recover. Something happened to them too, something similar to our experience." Theodore's face had gone pale. "My great-uncles," he said quietly, "Edward and Edwin Wright. They were twins who fought for the Union. Both were wounded at Gettysburg and brought back to Maple Hill to convalesce. What happened to them? Lillian pressed. Theodore folded his newspaper with deliberate care. Family history says that Edwin died of his wounds, but Edward lived a long life. He never married, but accomplished remarkable things, became a renowned physician who developed new treatments for battlefield trauma, established a hospital for veterans, wrote extensively about the relationship between physical and psychological healing. He didn't just live a long life, Lillian said, certainty in her voice. He lived 2 lives, his and Edwin's combined. Theodore stared at his daughter for a long moment. How could you possibly know that? Because it's happening again, Lillian said simply. History repeating itself. This house does something to twins. Something in its very structure or location facilitates merger rather than separation. She looked from her father to her mother and back again. I need access to the family archives to understand what we've become and what we might still become. That afternoon, Theodore led Lillian to the rarely visited attic, where generations of Wright family documents had been carefully preserved in cedar chests and leather-bound volumes. I'm still Lillian, she assured him. And I'm also Clara. And I'm something new that includes both of us while being more than either alone. It's complicated, Father, but not in a bad way. Theodore nodded slowly, turning the key in the lock. Then let's find out who else in our family might have experienced what you're going through. Perhaps the past can help us understand the present and prepare for the future. The attic of Maple Hill Manor held the accumulated history of 7 generations of Wrights. Dust motes danced in shafts of autumn sunlight as Theodore led Lillian between rows of trunks, shelves of leather-bound ledgers, and stacks of yellowed correspondence tied with faded ribbons. The air smelled of old paper, cedar, and secrets long kept. The family archives are organized chronologically, Theodore explained, indicating sections divided by decades. My great-uncle's materials would be here, in the Civil War period. Lillian approached the indicated shelf with a sense of anticipation that originated partly from her own natural curiosity and partly from Clara's consciousness, which had grown increasingly active since they'd entered the attic. She ran her fingers along the spines of journals and ledgers until she felt a peculiar warmth beneath her fingertips. Not physical heat, but a resonance that reminded her of the sensation when she and Clara had first interlaced their fingers for Hawthorne's photograph. This one, she said, pulling out a slim volume bound in faded blue leather. The journal belonged to Dr. Howard Fletcher. Not their doctor, Fletcher, but his grandfather, who had been the Wright family physician during the Civil War era. His neat, precise handwriting documented the medical care of Edward and Edwin Wright following their injuries at Gettysburg. July 18, 1863, Lillian read aloud. The Wright twins continue to exhibit the most peculiar symptoms. Their wounds are healing at different rates. Edward's with remarkable speed, while Edwin's fester despite identical treatment. More concerning is the apparent transfer of physical and mental attributes between them. Edward now speaks with Edwin's distinctive Virginia accent, while Edwin demonstrates Edward's facility with mathematics, despite having no formal training in the subject. Theodore pulled up a dusty chair and sat heavily. I had heard stories, of course, family legends about the remarkable twins. But I always assumed they were exaggerations, the kind of myths that grow around unusual siblings. Lillian continued reading, flipping through pages that documented increasingly strange phenomena. Edwin's gradual physical diminishment paralleling Edward's unexpected vitality. Edwin's knowledge and memories appearing intact in Edward's mind. The brothers' apparent ability to communicate without speaking. December 3rd, 1863. She read, Edwin Wright passed away this morning. Though passed away seems an insufficient description for what I observed. His physical form ceased functioning, yet there was no sense of a spirit departing. Rather, it seemed as if whatever animated him had already transferred elsewhere. specifically into his brother Edward, who at the moment of Edwin's death cried out in his twin's voice before falling into a deep sleep from which he has yet to awaken. Theodore rubbed his eyes. I knew Edwin died of his wounds, but not like this. Listen to what happened next, Lillian said, turning the page. December 7th, 1863. Edward Wright has awakened, but he is not the same man. He speaks sometimes with his own voice, sometimes with Edwin's. His knowledge encompasses both his medical studies and Edwin's military strategies. Most remarkably, he claims to experience himself not as a single consciousness, but as two minds operating in concert within one body. They spent the entire afternoon in the attic, discovering additional accounts of the Wright twins' transformation. Letters Edward had written describing his integrated consciousness, observations from family members noting his altered personality, and most significant, architectural plans that revealed Maple Hill Manor had been constructed according to principles of sacred geometry. The proportions are based on the golden ratio, Theodore explained, unrolling blueprints from 1783. My ancestor Jonathan Wright was deeply involved in Masonic traditions and certain esoteric practices. He designed this house according to mathematical principles believed to facilitate connections between physical and spiritual realms. That's why it happened here, Lillian said, the realization dawning. The house itself is a catalyst. They found other accounts as well. Brief mentions of twin cousins who had visited the manor in 1825 and departed fundamentally changed. A series of letters from 1879 describing twin sisters who had experienced a melding of minds during an extended stay, though without the complete physical merger that Clara and Lillian had undergone. It's been happening for generations, Lillian whispered, but never quite the same way twice. As the short winter day faded into dusk, they made their most significant discovery yet. A hidden compartment in the back of an old desk containing a slim manuscript entitled The Convergence of Dual Souls, written by Edward Wright 30 years after his brother's death. I believe what happened between my brother and myself was not an anomaly, but a glimpse into the true nature of consciousness. The manuscript began. The boundaries we perceive between individual minds are perhaps more permeable than science currently recognizes, particularly between twins, whose shared origin creates channels through which consciousness may flow more freely. Lillian read the manuscript with growing excitement, finding in Edward's careful documentation of his experiences uncanny parallels to her own. He described the initial disorientation of hosting two consciousnesses, the gradual integration of memories and abilities, and eventually the emergence of a third unified awareness that transcended both original personalities while preserving their essential qualities. Most significant, she read, is my conviction that this transformation was not merely personal, but reflects a broader potential within human consciousness. The capacity to transcend the limitations of individual identity and experience a more expansive state of being. Maple Hill Manor, designed according to principles that facilitate such transcendence, has proven an ideal environment for this evolution, though I suspect similar transformations could occur elsewhere under the right conditions. Theodore listened with a mixture of wonder and concern. If what he suggests is true, if this is some kind of evolutionary possibility within human consciousness, then what you and Clara have experienced could have implications far beyond our family. Lillian nodded, closing the manuscript carefully. That's what Clara has been trying to tell me. We're not just an anomaly or a supernatural curiosity. We're an early example of something potentially universal. As they descended from the attic, carrying selected documents for further study, Theodore asked the question that now seemed inevitable. What happens next for you? Does your transformation continue to evolve? Will you change further? Lillian paused on the landing, considering. I think we're still becoming, she said finally. The integration feels complete in many ways, But there are still moments when Clara's consciousness seems to expand beyond our shared form, when I sense her extending into the house itself, or connecting with something larger that I can't quite perceive yet. Theodore nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Edward's manuscript mentions something similar, phases of expansion that continued long after the initial merger. He described it as consciousness without boundaries, extending beyond the physical form to encompass environments and eventually other minds. That's what the house does, Lillian said with sudden certainty. It dissolves boundaries, not just between twins, but between consciousness and environment, maybe even between different consciousnesses entirely. That night, alone in her room, Lillian sat at her desk, reviewing the documents they'd discovered, the implications slowly crystallizing in her mind. Clara's consciousness moved through their shared thoughts with unusual clarity, offering insights and connections that Lillian might have missed alone. "We need to document this properly," she said aloud, pulling a fresh journal from her desk drawer. "Not just for ourselves, but for whoever comes after us. Other twins who might experience this. Other people who might discover their consciousness is more flexible, more expandable than they realized." Outside her window, the moon rose over Maple Hill Manor, its light casting long shadows across the grounds. Within those shadows, Lillian sensed something new awakening, not just within herself, but within the very structure that had facilitated her transformation. The house was more than wood and stone. It was a vessel for possibility, a gateway to understanding what human consciousness might yet become. Summer 1915 brought sweltering heat to Connecticut, warming the stones of Maple Hill Manor until they radiated heat long into the evening. Lillian spent these long summer days testing the boundaries of her transformed consciousness, methodically documenting new abilities and sensations in a journal that had grown to hundreds of pages. Dr. Fletcher visited weekly, his scientific curiosity evolving into something approaching reverence as he witnessed capabilities that defied conventional explanation. "Try again," he encouraged, on a particularly humid afternoon, as they sat in the conservatory, windows open to catch any stray breeze. "Focus on the far side of the room." Lillian nodded and closed her eyes, extending her awareness beyond her physical form. At first, she sensed only the immediate surroundings, the wicker chair beneath her, the brush of air from a nearby palm frond, the scent of orchids blooming in the corner. Then, as she relaxed into the practice that had become familiar over recent months, her perception expanded. "There's a beetle on the sill of the far window," she said without opening her eyes. "A ladybug with 7 spots, and beside it, a small key." Dr. Fletcher made a soft sound of amazement. "Correct on all counts. And the key? Iron, old. It belongs to the small cabinet in Father's study, the one he thinks he lost last winter." This ability, to extend her perception beyond normal physical limitations, had developed gradually since the discovery of Edward Wright's manuscript. At first, Lillian could only sense people and objects in adjacent rooms. Now her awareness could encompass the entire manor and its grounds when she concentrated fully. "Remarkable," Dr. Fletcher murmured, making notes. "And this perception, it's visual or something else?" Lillian considered. "Neither. Both. It's like knowing without seeing. Information that arrives directly in my consciousness without passing through normal senses." She opened her eyes. "Clara was always more intuitive than me. I think this ability comes primarily from her." The integration of their separate abilities had become more refined over time. Lillian could now identify which aspects of her expanded consciousness originated with Clara and which had been her own, while simultaneously recognizing that these distinctions were becoming less relevant as their merged identity solidified into something truly unified. This summer had brought new experiments as well. Deliberate attempts to test Edward Wright's theories about consciousness extending beyond individual boundaries. Lillian had discovered, through careful practice, that she could briefly project her awareness into plants and animals on the estate grounds, experiencing their existence from the inside. "I can feel what the roses feel," she had told her mother after one such experiment. Not thoughts exactly, since they don't think the way we do, but sensations, sunlight, water, the movement of nutrients through stems. It's peaceful. With animals, the connection was more complex. Cats experience the world primarily through scent and sound, rather than vision. Birds perceived patterns of air currents invisible to human senses. Insects processed information through completely alien frameworks. Each connection taught Lillian something new about consciousness itself, how diverse its expressions could be, how uniquely it was shaped by different physical forms. More challenging and somewhat unsettling were her attempts to extend her awareness toward other humans. Unlike plants and animals, people had their own strong consciousness that resisted casual intrusion. Lillian discovered she could sense emotions and surface thoughts from family members and servants only when they were in heightened emotional states or deeply relaxed, their mental boundaries temporarily less rigid. "It feels intrusive," she confessed to Dr. Fletcher. "I don't pursue those connections unless invited." The invitation came unexpectedly from Margaret, who had watched her daughter's evolution with a mixture of scientific curiosity and maternal concern. "I want to understand," she said one evening as they sat in the garden, watching fireflies emerge in the deepening twilight. "What it feels like to be as you are now." Lillian took her mother's hand, their physical connection facilitating the mental one she now carefully established. She didn't force her consciousness into Margaret's mind, but rather created a gentle opening, a shared space between them where understanding could flow in both directions. "Oh," Margaret breathed, her eyes widening. For a brief moment, she experienced the world as Lillian did. Senses expanded to encompass the entire garden, awareness of each firefly's position without looking, the taste of approaching rain hours before clouds would appear, and beneath it all, the constant warm presence of Clara's consciousness intertwined with Lillian's own. When the connection ended, tears shimmered in Margaret's eyes. "I had no idea," she whispered. "It's beautiful." Not all experiments yielded such positive results. Lillian discovered limitations to her abilities. She could not extend her awareness beyond the boundaries of the estate, could not maintain connections with animals or plants for more than a few minutes without exhaustion, and could not perceive the future, despite occasional flashes of intuition that seemed predictive. Most significantly, she found that strong emotions could disrupt her control, causing unpredictable fluctuations in her abilities. Anger narrowed her expanded perception back to normal human range. Grief caused Clara's consciousness to temporarily separate, creating a visible manifestation beside Lillian that unnerved anyone who witnessed it. Joy, conversely, enhanced all her abilities, allowing for deeper connections and broader awareness. Emotional states influence consciousness more profoundly than we realize. Dr. Fletcher observed after one particularly dramatic demonstration where Lillian's happiness at mastering a difficult piano piece had caused every light in the manor to brighten simultaneously. Perhaps this is why Maple Hill Manor facilitates these transformations. Its design somehow amplifies the connection between emotion and perception. By late August, Lillian had developed sufficient understanding of her abilities to attempt her most ambitious experiment yet, leaving the grounds of Maple Hill Manor for an extended period. Previous brief excursions to nearby properties had proven uncomfortable, though not impossible, creating a sensation she described as stretched thin the farther she traveled from the estate. "I want to visit Hartford," she announced at breakfast, "for a full day, to see if I can maintain integration away from the manor." Theodore looked concerned. "Is that wise? What if something goes wrong?" "That's why both of you will come with me," Lillian said, having already considered this. "And Dr. Fletcher. If I start to disconnect, we'll return immediately." The experiment proved more successful than any of them anticipated. Lillian maintained her integrated consciousness throughout the day-long visit to Hartford, moving through the bustling city streets with both Lillian's confidence and Clara's sensitivity fully intact. She visited bookshops, attended a lecture at Trinity College, and even made a brief appearance at a gallery opening where her unusual presence, not quite one person, not quite two, attracted curious but not alarmed attention. "Your approach makes all the difference," she explained to her parents as their car wound back toward Maple Hill in the evening. "When I tried to maintain separation between Lillian and Clara during previous trips, it created strain. But when I fully embrace our integration, allow us to simply be who we've become, the distance from the manor becomes almost irrelevant." As summer waned into autumn, bringing the second anniversary of the birthday photograph that had captured the first visible evidence of their transformation, Lillian made her most profound discovery yet regarding the nature of her condition. During an intense thunderstorm reminiscent of the night Clara had briefly rematerialized the previous year, she experienced a spontaneous expansion of consciousness that temporarily extended throughout the entire estate, sensing simultaneous events in different rooms, perceiving the precise location of each family member and servant, even briefly accessing fragments of others' thoughts when they focused intensely on specific emotions or ideas. The experience lasted only minutes before receding to her normal perceptual boundaries, but it revealed possibilities that fundamentally altered her understanding. Perhaps the absorption of Clara represented not an endpoint, but an intermediate stage in an ongoing evolution toward a form of consciousness that transcended conventional individual limitations. "What we are becoming," she wrote that night in her journal, "may have less to do with the merging of two specific people than with the dissolution of the very concept of separate identity. Clara and I may simply be early participants in a transformation potentially available to any consciousness willing to release the illusion of separateness." This revelation, simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying in its implications, marked Lillian's transition from passive subject of an inexplicable phenomenon to active explorer of consciousness beyond conventional human experience. As summer gave way to fall, she began to design new experiments, not just to understand what she had become, but to explore what she, and potentially others, might yet become. The autumn equinox of 1917 painted Maple Hill Manor in shades of crimson and gold, the maple trees that gave the estate its name, transformed by the changing season. Inside the grand salon, a small gathering of family and trusted associates had assembled at Lillian's invitation to witness what she described simply as a demonstration. The room had been arranged with care, chairs positioned in a semicircle facing the burgundy settee where the original photograph had been taken nearly 5 years earlier. That photograph, in its ornate silver frame, now stood on a small table beside the settee, a visible reminder of how this extraordinary journey had begun. Theodore and Margaret Wright sat in the front row, their faces reflecting a mixture of anticipation and pride that would have been unimaginable in the early days of their daughter's transformation. Beside them sat Dr. Fletcher, his scientific journal open on his lap, pen poised to document what would be his final entry in the extraordinary case study that had consumed nearly 5 years of his career. Miss Eleanor Bennett, the photographer who had captured Lillian's 11th birthday portrait, stood to one side with her camera ready, hoping to document visually what words might fail to convey. A hush fell over the gathering as Lillian entered the room. At 14, she had grown into a striking young woman whose presence commanded attention in ways that went beyond her unusual nature. Her honey blonde hair was arranged in a simple style that framed features that had settled into a perfect blend of both twins' characteristics. Lillian's strong chin and decisive gaze harmonizing with Clara's delicate cheekbones and gentle smile. She wore a dress of blue silk that seemed to shift between navy and cornflower depending on how the light struck it. A visual representation of the dual nature housed within her singular form. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice carrying easily in the perfect acoustics of the salon. "What I'm about to show you represents not the end of a journey, but rather a milestone along a path that continues to unfold before me, before us." She seated herself on the settee in the exact position she and Clara had occupied on that fateful birthday. The afternoon sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the polished floor and creating an atmosphere both solemn and magical. "For nearly 5 years, Clara and I have existed in a state of gradual integration," Lillian explained. "What began as a mysterious merger captured in silver nitrate has evolved into something far more profound than the simple absorption of one twin by another. We have become a new kind of consciousness, one that honors our separate origins while transcending individual limitations." As she spoke, those present noticed subtle changes beginning to occur around her. The air seemed to shimmer slightly, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The rainbow patterns cast by the stained glass intensified, their colors deepening to jewel-like brilliance. Most remarkably, Lillian herself began to emit a subtle luminosity, as if light were being generated from within her, rather than merely reflected off her form. Over time, we've discovered that our transformation extends beyond our physical form to encompass our relationship with Maple Hill Manor itself. This extraordinary place designed by our ancestor to facilitate connections between different states of consciousness. The luminosity around Lillian increased, and as the gathered witnesses watched in awe, she performed what Dr. Fletcher would later describe in his journal as the most profound demonstration of integrated consciousness yet observed. With a gentle exhalation and slight outward motion of her hands, Lillian projected a visible representation of both original twins around her physical form, not as separate entities, but as complementary aspects of a more complete being. Clara's translucent essence intertwined with Lillian's solid presence in a living embodiment of the merger captured in the photograph. The projection wasn't ghostly or spectral, but rather appeared as two overlapping light forms, distinct yet harmoniously connected, sharing the same physical space while maintaining their individual qualities. As sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, those present reported an extraordinary visual effect. For several breathtaking moments, light seemed to pass through the projection in ways that created not shadows, but intensified illumination, as if Lillian's integrated being enhanced rather than obstructed the natural radiance around her. "What we've become," Lillian continued, her voice now carrying subtle harmonic overtones that suggested two voices speaking in perfect unison, "represents a possibility that extends beyond our personal experience. The boundaries we perceive between individual consciousnesses are more permeable than conventional understanding recognizes. Under the right conditions, with the right catalyst, those boundaries can dissolve, allowing for states of awareness that transcend ordinary limitations." The projection maintained its clarity for nearly 5 minutes, far longer than any previous manifestation, before gradually reintegrating with Lillian's physical form. As it did, the room itself seemed to respond, the air becoming charged with a palpable energy that several witnesses later described as deeply peaceful and inexplicably familiar. When the demonstration concluded, Lillian remained seated for a moment, her eyes closed, her expression one of profound contentment. When she opened her eyes and looked at the gathered family and friends, many were surprised to find tears on their own cheeks, moved by something they had witnessed but could not entirely explain. Dr. Fletcher broke the silence first, setting aside his scientific journal with a gesture that acknowledged the inadequacy of clinical observation in the face of what they had experienced. "What we observed today transcends the merger of two individuals, he said simply. It suggests instead a glimpse of consciousness as fundamentally unified rather than inherently separate, a perspective that, once witnessed, transforms not only our understanding of the subjects, but of ourselves as observers. In the days that followed, Lillian worked with Miss Bennet to document her continuing evolution through photographs that captured aspects of her expanded consciousness in ways words could not convey. The resulting images, eventually published in Edward Wright's revised manuscript, The Convergence of Dual Souls, showed a young woman who appeared both ordinary and extraordinary. Physically normal in most respects, but surrounded by patterns of light that conventional photography should not have been able to capture. Theodore, examining these images in his study, finally asked the question that had been forming in his mind since the demonstration. Where does this lead? What do you ultimately become? Lillian considered this thoughtfully. I don't know exactly, she admitted. But Clara and I believe our experience is just one expression of a broader potential within human consciousness. Edward Wright sensed it after his merger with Edwin. Other twins who experienced partial integration at Maple Hill perceived it as well. There's something more expansive waiting beyond the boundaries of individual identity. Not the loss of self, but the recognition of a larger self that includes but transcends our separate awareness. Margaret, who had joined them in the study, placed her hand over her daughter's. Will you stay? At Maple Hill? Lillian nodded. For now, yes. This place facilitated our transformation. Its very structure creates conditions that allow for expanded consciousness. I need to understand that better, document it more fully, before considering what might come next. What came next unfolded gradually over subsequent years, as Lillian continued to explore the boundaries of her integrated consciousness while sharing her discoveries with carefully selected researchers and spiritual seekers. Maple Hill Manor, once feared for the strange phenomena it had witnessed, became known instead as a sanctuary for those interested in the frontiers of human awareness, a place where the conventional boundaries between individual minds could be safely examined and, under the right circumstances, temporarily transcended. The portrait that had started it all, the simple birthday photograph that once terrified those who looked closely enough to see the merged hands at its center, took on new significance as well. Rather than an object of fear, it became a focus of reverence, a visual testament to the possibility of connection beyond separation. Visitors to the manor, who gazed upon it, no longer saw a frightening anomaly, but rather an invitation to consider consciousness itself from a different perspective. And Lillian, standing in the quiet light of her ancestral home years later, understood the truth that had been present from the beginning. She hadn't lost Clara. She had become more because of her. Their story, which had seemed at first a supernatural curiosity or medical anomaly, had revealed itself instead as an early chapter in humanity's ongoing exploration of its own potential, a reminder that the boundaries we perceive as most fundamental may also be the most illusory. What had once inspired fear now offered hope, the possibility that connection runs deeper than separation, that consciousness extends beyond the limitations of individual forms, and that in the seeming loss of distinct identity might lie the discovery of a more profound wholeness. The twins of 1912, through their extraordinary transformation, had not disappeared, but expanded, becoming not less, but more, pioneers in a journey that continued to unfold, illuminating paths that others might someday follow toward a future where the illusion of separateness no longer limited human potential.